Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read a little bit from my novel of just 2 or 3 pages, and then I guess Parul and I'll have our conversation. The book is semi-autobiographical. That it tells a story that is extremely close to my own, which is that my family came to America in the late 70s. We were in America for about 2 years. We lived in Queens. Then my older brother had an accident in a swimming pool. He dived in. He struck his head on the bottom of the pool, and he remained underwater for 3 minutes, and the oxygen deprivation caused severe brain damage. My brother was in hospitals for 2 years, and then we decided to bring him home and take care of him ourselves. And this, of course, caused all sorts of weird stuff to occur. It caused devastation. Primarily, it caused devastation. There is a tendency, though, when I present to try to make things amusing, because frankly, who wants to listen to gloom? You know, everybody has their own problems. Who wants to listen to other people's? But it caused all sorts of strange things to occur. My mother was admired greatly by the Indian community, and because the Indian community really respected the sacrifice that my family was making. And so among Indians, oftentimes, people who really who sacrifice are viewed as not just virtuous, but almost holy. And so before the SATs, people used to bring their kids over to get her blessings. I asked my parents' permission before I wrote the book. And my mother said, "Akhil, just make sure I look good." And my father has a very glum nature. And he doesn't read, nor does he see the point of reading. So when I told him that I was going to write this book, he said, "Why?" He said, if you want to keep a secret, put it in a book." And then I wrote this book. It took 12.5 years. I'm full of animus towards the book. I handed it in, the copy edited it and put it into galleys, which are bound proofs. And they sent it to, so I asked my parents, they were sending these things around. I asked my father if he wanted to read it, and he said, "Why?" I was there. And I asked my mother. Actually, I offered the book to my mother, and she asked me if it would be okay if she didn't read it. She said it was so sad, Akhil. It was so sad during those years that I just don't want to remember. Which strikes me as very mentally healthy, you know. So this is my second novel. My first book I think of as a very good book. I say this because it got a very bad review in the New York Times Book Review.
Long before my time.
And this book has gotten very good reviews. I have chosen not to read the reviews because I find that it makes me crazy. You know, it's like the highs are very high and the lows are very low, and it seems best to just stay out of that craziness. When my agent, I'm a neurotic person. I'm neurotic, and I work hard at managing my craziness. So, for example, when my agent called me to tell me, I told him I wanted no news. I don't want to hear good news. I don't want to hear bad news. And so he calls me, and he said, "Akhil, I have news." And I'm thinking, why are you calling me? I don't want news. And part of me, growing up as an immigrant, my sense is, always be ready for a beating. And in fact, it is good to be beaten. If you're beaten, it means that you're getting stronger. This is the crazy stuff that my parents taught me. That my hitting you now is going to help you later on. So I said to my agent, "Sure, go ahead, tell me this news." And he said, "Oh, Akhil, you're going to be on the cover of the New York Times Book Review." And my first thought was, thank God, another disappointment avoided. So the book has two beginnings and two endings. I'm going to read only from the very beginning, and I'll tell you some of the things that I was thinking as I was writing this thing. As far back as I can remember, my parents have bothered each other. In India, we lived in 2 concrete rooms on the roof of a house. The bathroom stood separate from the living quarters. The sink was attached to one of the exterior walls. Each night, my father would stand before the sink, the sky above him full of stars, and brush his teeth until his gums bled. Then he would spit the blood into the sink and turn to my mother and say, "Death, Shubha, death. No matter what we do, we will all die." "Yes, yes, beat drums," my mother said once. "Tell the newspapers too. Make sure everyone knows this thing you have discovered." Like many people of her generation, those born before independence, my mother viewed gloom as unpatriotic. To complain was to show that you were not willing to accept difficulties, that you were not willing to do the hard work that was needed to build the country. My father was only 2 years older than my mother. Unlike her, he saw dishonesty and selfishness everywhere. Not only did he see these things, but he believed that everybody else did too, and that people were deliberately not acknowledging what they saw. My mother's irritation at his spitting blood he interpreted as hypocrisy. So I begin the book with, as far back as I can remember, my parents have bothered each other because people love fights. They love them. Somebody could be performing Hamlet here, and if 2 idiots begin punching each other in the back, we'll all turn around to look at the idiots. So whenever possible, begin with a fight. Then I switched to putting in physical description. So in India, we lived in 2 concrete rooms on the roof of a house. The bathroom stood separate from the living quarters. And the reason this is the exact same thing that I do at the very beginning of my first book. And the reason I do this is you get the reader interested, and then you need to tell the reader what sort of story he or she is going to be reading. That is, if you tell the reader what type of story, is it going to be a mimetic story, a basic traditional realistic story? Is it going to be a Kafkaesque story? What kind of story is it going to be? Then the reader knows how to invest. You're telling the reader how to care. You're helping the reader learn how to read this thing. So I begin, then I do that. And then, of course, for me, it's hard not to be funny because the world is just so strange. That the world is so delightful that why not laugh all the time? I tend to know when a book is done when certain qualities begin appearing in the prose. So, for example, I begin to notice that physically beautiful things are next to physically gross things. So, for example, that sentence, "Each night my father would stand before the sink, the sky above him full of stars, and brush his teeth until his gums bled." Because for me, the beautiful things always stand next to gross things, or they're not far apart, and there's pleasure in both of them. There's delight in both of them. And then the other thing that I sort of know, when I see it, I know that the book is nearly done, is almost fully baked, is when I begin to find that all of my characters are right and all of my characters are wrong. So, for example, the mother is quite sane in saying, what's the benefit of gloom? Like, how am I helped by being pessimistic? To me, that's a very legitimate viewpoint. But her motivation for being positive is wanting social status. And that itself is undermining because you're giving the world a lot of power over you. And then the father is just pointlessly cynical. Like, what is why see everything in such a negative way? Except if you are in India. Now, if any of you have spent much time in India, it does make sense to be cynical about everything. It's just that sort of country. The book has a very slight plot. That is, it doesn't have very strong causation. A occurs and this causes B, and then B occurs and there is C. But they're almost consecutive instead of, it's almost like a relationship of time instead of a relationship of chronology. And if you have very slight causation, you need to do all sorts of things to make the reading experience pleasurable to the reader. So one thing that you can do is have small sections. Instead of long chapters, have smaller sections. The reason is that we as readers always feel kind of happy when a chapter is done. We feel like we've accomplished something. And so let's give the reader more of this sense of accomplishment. And so there's these smaller sections. The problem is that every solution creates its own set of problems. So having a small section means that each time there's a jump, and each time there's a jump and the reader has to start again, you have to get the reader to reinvest, which means that, okay, now I have to do some other work to grab the reader. And so always you're running it, you find a solution and then you have to find more solutions. Everything is couture, there's nothing off the rack, unfortunately. So my mother's irritation at his spitting blood he interpreted as hypocrisy. My father was an accountant. He had wanted to immigrate to the West ever since he was in his early 20s, ever since America liberalized its immigration policies in 1965. His wish rose out of self-loathing. Often when he walked down the street in Delhi, he would feel that the buildings he passed were indifferent to him, that he mattered so little to them that he might as well not have been born. Because he attributed this feeling to his circumstances and not to the fact that he was the sort of person who sensed buildings having opinions of him. He believed that if he were somewhere else, especially somewhere where he was paid in dollars and thus was rich, he would be a different person and one whose life had meaning. Another reason he wanted to emigrate was that he saw the West as glamorous with the excitement of science. In India in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, radios, televisions, and cars were not just expensive objects, but seen as almost supernatural. I remember that when we turned on the radio in our apartment, as the vacuum tubes warmed up, first the voices would sound far away, and then they would rush at us. And this was thrilling, as if the machine were making some special effort just for us. Of everybody in my family, my father loved science the most. He tried to bring it into his life by going to medical clinics and having his urine tested. He loved clinics and doctors' offices. Of course, hypochondria had something to do with this. My father suspected that there was something wrong with him and that it might be something physical. Also, sitting in the clinics and talking to doctors in lab coats, he felt that he was close to important things, that what the doctors were doing was the same as what doctors would do in England or Germany or America, that he was already there in those foreign countries. My mother had no interest in emigrating for herself. She was a high school economics teacher and she liked her job, but she thought that the West would provide me and my brother Birju with opportunities. Then came the emergency. Indira Gandhi suspended the Constitution and put thousands of politicians and journalists in jail. My parents, like almost everyone who had seen independence come, were very loyal. They were the sort of people who looked up at a cloud and thought, that's an Indian cloud. After the emergency, however, they began to think that even though they were ordinary and unlikely to get into political trouble, it might still be better to emigrate. All right, I'm going to read one or two more paragraphs because I have some good jokes. Okay? I used to assume that my father had been assigned to us by the government. This was because he appeared to serve no purpose. When he got home in the evening, all he did was sit in his chair in the living room, drink tea, and read the paper. Often he looked angry. By the time we left for America, when I was 8 and Birju was 12, I knew that the government had not assigned him to live with us. Still, I continued to think that he served no purpose. My father, who had gone to America a year before us, was waiting for us in the arrivals hall at the airport. He was leaning against a metal railing and looking irritated. The sight of him made me anxious. All right, one more paragraph. The apartment he had rented was in a tall brown brick building in Queens. The gray metal front door swung open into a foyer with a wooden floor. Beyond this was a living room with a reddish-brown carpet that went from wall to wall. I had never seen a carpet except in movies. Birju and my parents walked across the foyer and into the living room. I went to the carpet's edge and stopped. A brass strip held the carpet to the floor. I took a step forward, trying not to put my weight down. I felt like I was stepping onto a painting. Okay, I'll stop there.
Hi, I'm Parul. First, I just want to say it's a thrill talking to Akhil. People are saying that this is the first great novel of the year. And I tend to agree with them. I think that it's strange, it's funny, it's so dark. Don't let all this fool you. It's so grim, but it's also so absurd and so strange. And actually, let's just keep going from where you stopped reading. Your parents immigrated late 70s, 79. And a lot of the light in this book comes from, at least for me, Birju, the protagonist, sort of figuring out America, being dazzled by things. And I wanted to know, that was, you were the same age as Birju when you came over. And I was wondering if you could talk about your own feelings when you moved here. Were you in awe? Were you more bewildered, less sure of yourself?
The protagonist of the book is a boy named Ajay, and he's 8 years old when he immigrates, which was my age when we came to America. I found America amazing, really just an amazing place. I felt very much on the outside of it. Like even when I was asleep, I had the sense that I was sleeping in America. For me, the most amazing thing was TV. I especially loved the show Love Boat. I found America intimidating in many ways. I experienced a lot of bullying. Whereas in India, because I was part of an extended family, I could there were always people to talk to. People who I could turn to for comfort. Now I was pushed into a much closer relationship with my parents, who are very difficult people. They're wonderful people, but they're extremely difficult people. And in my own experience was that after a few months, I actually just stopped talking. I just stopped talking and didn't talk for a couple of years. So it was I got stopped talking. What I began doing was reading constantly, reading and watching TV. Like I would read with a book open in my lap. I would watch TV with a book open in my lap. Whenever the commercials would come on, I would begin reading, and I read everything. I read The Old Man and the Sea, and I read Danny and the Dinosaur. It didn't really matter as long as it was not real, because I just wanted to vanish. That was my experience. Yeah. When I was writing the book, there was a draft a couple of years ago that my British editor liked very much and said, this is fine, we can go ahead with this thing. And I wanted the book to be over. I felt like I had sort of ruined a decade basically on this thing. But I felt that the book was so grim that it wasn't full of light. It wasn't possible for the reader to walk in and see grimness and also laugh. And I didn't want to offer that experience to the reader. For me, the book is very different from my first book in that with my first book, I wanted to write a book which people would read and they'd think, oh, wow, that's a good writer. Whereas with this one, I wanted to write a book that is useful. And so it's the technology of the book is very different. The transitions between paragraphs are very different. The transitions are, whereas with the last book, there would be a push at the end of a paragraph and there would be a catch in the opening line of the next paragraph. Here, I am regularly sort of breaking that rhythm. I keep preventing the reader from going too fast because I want the book to be available. I want the book because the book oftentimes handles such difficult material, I want it to be something which the reader can approach at his own pace, and not a book which, because of its urgency, imposes itself on the reader.
And is this something that you could do? I mean, the question, obviously lends itself, like, this could have been a memoir. Is there something about this being fiction that, as you said, can make it more useful to a reader or a richer experience for the reader, or maybe even just a more interesting experience for you as a writer?
I feel like when I write nonfiction, like I've written some nonfiction for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I'm obligated to be true in every way. I can't just make up stuff, and which is unfortunate. Which would mean that I wouldn't be able to use dialogue, which would mean that I would have to discuss things which don't interest me. So, for example, or discuss all the things that occurred. So, as an example, after we brought my brother home to take care of him, we began to have miracle workers come and try to wake him. These were crackpots. These were all Indians, all Indian men, full of vanity, and they would say things like, God had visited them in a dream, and come up with a cure. And my mother would let them do it because her trying every cure was almost an expression of faith. It was a way of showing to God that she would keep going, and that she would shame God with her devotion. I mean, she actually said that after my brother died, that she had always thought that she would win, that she would eventually be able to shame God into fixing Anup. And in the book, there's 5 or 6 of them. In reality, there were 70 or 80 of them. So it was like having a TV into mental illness on all the time. And having put that in the book would have changed the nature of the book. And so all sorts of things like that I didn't want to include.
So it's very interesting to talk to people who have read this book, who are reading this book, because they use very interesting language for it. People talk about being inside this book, being enveloped in this book, and I think part of that comes from the pacing. Like, this is a book where, as you said, not a great number of things happened. One terrible thing happens, but yet there is this propulsive pace. This is like an oddly, it's a page turner of terrible things leavened here and there by humor. So I was wondering, technically, how you managed to figure this out.
I mean, there's a couple of things that are going on. One is that the physical reality in the book is a specific type of physical reality. That is, it's missing sound, it's missing smell, it's missing tactile elements to it, right? It doesn't. So characters are rarely cold, they're rarely hot. And the idea is that that physical reality then has less friction, so the reader can enter it and leave it, and can enter a scene and leave a scene with much less friction. So that was one thing. And then there's all sorts of other little techniques, such as just not having chapter headings, for example, is a way of making the experience a little bit more immersive. That you can keep going on and on. And then there's certain things where you actually are doing, where I'm actually doing things which are the opposite of what one would want. And yet the effect is that it makes the book much more compulsive. So I'll give you an example. Okay, so this is at some point the family, they've been living in America now for about 6 weeks. My mother, Birju, and I had taken everything we could from the airplane. Red Air India blankets, pillows with paper pillowcases, headsets, sachets of ketchup, packets of salt and pepper, air sickness bags. Birju and I used the blankets until they frayed and tore. Around that time, we started going to school. I had a shy nature. "You're a tiger at home," my mother said, "and a cat outside." At school, I sat at the very back of the class in the row closest to the door. Often I could not understand what my teacher was saying. Now, the normal transition would be to go, around that time we started going to school, and then next paragraph, at school I sat at the very back of the class, right? So there's a push and then there's a catch. Instead I insert, "I had a shy nature. You're a tiger at home," my mother said, "and a cat outside." And putting in that sentence actually makes the reader feel, softens the narrative, makes the narrative have less of an edge, by removing the grabbing, and so the reader can move forward at their own pace, or thinks that they're moving forward at their own pace. So hundreds of little solutions like that.
And I think, it just occurred to me as you were talking about that there's also the claustrophobia of the family provides its own pressure on the situation. And this is the second, your first book, An Obedient Father, which is terrifying and wonderful, and it's a story of this incredibly corrupt government official, a bureaucrat who molests his daughter, and it sort of happens again. It takes place again, like in roughly the same time period, right before emergency.
It covers that period. I mean, it covers the bulk of the events occur like 1990 and 91. But the story covers pre-independence.
It does span, but most of the action feels like it's taking place on this chessboard with just a few players, and there's no room to move. There's no room to maneuver. It's incredibly agonizing. And the space seems to shrink and shrink and shrink, and one character gradually has a space contained. He's more and more confined. And the family for you seems to be this theater that you've taken to, and you've been, I don't know if theater is the right word or lab is the word, but you're studying pressure and you're studying power, it seems to me. That seems to be your arena, not so much necessarily the individual or the national narrative, but this particular smaller group. Is that true? What about the family attracts you in this particular way?
The most important thing for me is to love and to be loved. The bulk, almost all of that is going to come through family. And so that's the thing that I'm going to turn to, because that's where I draw my emotional sustenance from. So that's what it is. I mean, I think that's really all it is.
Yeah. But within the context of the family, just because when you're reading these books, you see so many people suffering in different ways, and you see people doing different things with suffering. And it's not didactic what you're doing. I don't think that you're ever at a moment being like this, as you're saying, like the minute you feel like a character is both wrong or right, you feel like the book is beginning to be completed. But at the same time, I can't help but wondering when you're presenting us all of these different situations in both of your novels of what people do with pain. Do they put their pain on other people? Do they try to run from it? Do they become addicted to books or to booze? Is there a sort of edifying thing happening in your books? You want them to be useful to us, but how? Are you trying to tell us something about how we should understand suffering, what we can do with it?
All decent books are useful. That is, at worst, they're going to give us an escape from our life. And at best, they're going to remove some of our loneliness. This book, for me, the usefulness of it is that everybody is going to go through illness. They've either gone through it or they're going to go through it. And everybody's going to watch their loved ones die. And so it's useful to read about an experience and say, oh, I am not strange for having that thought. So, for example, when somebody you love dies, you begin thinking, what the hell was that all about? If he was going to die, why did I love him for so long? And you feel almost betrayed. And that sort of thought is a thought that everybody will have. And it's useful to have read about and to say, oh, okay, this is what it means to be a human being.
It kind of comes back to that opening anecdote you were saying, the father being like, everybody's going to die, and the mother being like, we know. Right. But yet maybe we as a species need to keep hearing it, and then at the same time keep needing to be like, we know, this is not a new discovery. Getting back to the sort of fictionalized memoir, are there models that you had that you were thinking of, books that have done this sort of thing, writers that have approached it in this particular way?
I read a lot of books trying to find solutions to problems that I was running into. So I read Joseph Roth's Radetzky March, just as a way to sort of handle time, A House for Mr. Biswas, housekeeping. I don't think it wasn't. I didn't really think of this book as a fictionalized memoir. That wasn't how I thought of it. I thought of it as a novel, and so facing the challenges that novels have, which are simply to be interesting. I remember. Let me see if I can find this. I remember that when my brother had his accident, I used to cry all the time. I would, and I remember thinking at some point that I was glad that I was crying. This is me as a little kid. I was at 10 then, thinking, when I cry, I'm close to him. Because I can feel in my crying this impression of him. And then I remember reading this thing in Shakespeare. Let me see if I can find it, because somebody texted it to me or sent it to me. I'm sorry. 1 minute only. Okay. Where is this thing? Okay, here it is. So this is in The Life and Death of King John. Constance says, grief fills the room up of my absent child. Her child has just died. Grief fills up, her child has just died, and this man is saying to her that she grieves too much. She has to pull herself together. And she says, and this is the best fuck you ever written. Grief fills the room up of my absent child. Lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief? And I remember reading that and thinking, holy shit, this is exactly what I experienced with my brother.
But I mean, right, like that's Shakespeare. So I'm thinking about also the time it took you, and like this is one of those books that the backstory is sort of taking on its own power and becoming, interesting in its own right. And you wrote, I've heard 7,000 pages. 7,000 pages over 12 and a half years that you pared down to 224. Now, I would argue those are 224 perfect pages and worth the wait. But what was it that was it circling around the sort of narrative challenges you were setting yourself? Was it the nature of grief is so hard to, parse? Basically, Akhil, what were you doing?
Some of it I didn't. It was hard to have a steady viewpoint as to this subject matter. Like I would remember stuff that my parents did, and some days I would feel very, very angry, and some days I would feel real love for them, that they were behaving in such crazy ways. And so as a writer, it was hard to have a steady viewpoint. That was one thing. And then, but the real problem was how to write it as a book. And that was just a series of technical problems, one problem after another. So this book for 7 years was in third person. It was also written from the point of view of the father, from the point of view of the mother. I learned all sorts of really fantastic things, technical effects that I can generate now, which are useless, but I can generate them. So, for example, the Tolstoy, when you read War and Peace, can make you feel like you're hovering, right? That you're hovering in a room and can see everything. And the way he does this is that he'll describe a character from the outside, but a voice that'll be very accurate in his judgment. And then the next paragraph will be, you'll be inside of this character, and the judgment of the outside character will be confirmed, but it'll be much more detailed and much more sort of funny and full of life. And then there'll be a paragraph right afterwards, which will be, the third paragraph will be outside of that point of view. And that quick succession generates that sense of floating, free floating. So I learned how to do things like that. I had no use for that in this book, but I learned all sorts of weird technical things.
And I guess another reason, I mean, it is like, again, when you're reading this book, and I hope everybody reads this book, it's also one of those books that feels so deceptively simple. The language is so clean. It's just like, stones seen like at the bottom of a clear sort of stream. But then when you get into it, there are so many different books. And in your introduction, you said that every book teaches you how to read it. And I was thinking, I was like, that's a beautiful statement. And then I'm like, I don't know if I agree, because this book is like 4 books in one in certain ways, or at least 4 genres, distinct genres. There's, the coming to America story. There's the art, like portrait of an artist. We see out of the chaos of the family, Ajay sort of falling in love with reading, falling in love with books, and then starting to pattern himself after Hemingway, not necessarily for the prose, but for the lifestyle, for the glamour. And I wanted to talk to you about one of these strands. I wanted to talk to you about it feels right being here, to talk a little bit about the coming to America story, the immigrant story, and maybe even you as an immigrant writer and how you feel about that. Is that something that feels, is that a tradition you feel part of? Is it something that feels confining?
So there is sort of this genre of the immigrant novel. My tendency to resist it is based on the fact that I want to be viewed as me. And so if I am labeled as an immigrant novelist, somehow I feel diminished versus being called a novelist. It feels like somebody is patting me on my head. The reality is that I am an immigrant and I'm a novelist. It would be like saying a woman novelist. The category of the immigrant novel is not, that label is not applied fairly. So for example, it's not applied to Henry James, right? It's not applied to the ambassadors. It's not applied to a lot of Hemingway, where it would also be applied. It's not really applied to Panin. It seems that the immigrant novel, that label is applied to brown people and people who can be separated out in some way. All of that aside, it's not an inaccurate label, right? The fact that that the people who are applying it in ways that are inappropriate, I feel are inappropriate, doesn't mean that the label itself is inappropriate. And then my response now, with my first book, I was really, I was annoyed at all of this stuff. And now, you get older and you realize all through your life you're going to have to deal with idiots. And so, really try to just go around the idiot. Don't engage. So that's sort of my attitude now.
Yeah. But being brown in America and being, aside from like living in that sort of like literature ghetto, I read a pretty astonishing quote by you, and because you don't write about racism explicitly so much, but you said somewhere that you wanted to write a book that, quote, couldn't be resisted, and that you wanted a book that would overwhelm. And you said, it's a desire, an aesthetic, that comes personally from being ignored as a child and more widely from the racism of being an Indian in America. And I just thought that is one engine sort of fueling your work. And I was wondering, now you've been here and you've experienced, again, so many different New Yorks. You've been in Queens, you were in finance, from publishing to academia. And I'm thinking back as this sort of like, coming to Queens and sort of some of the sort of like discrimination and prejudice and bullying that you touch on in the book. And I was wondering if you see consistency, if you see changes. Other than getting that question, how do you feel about being an immigrant writer?
I'm sorry, what do I see as consistent? Like what
I mean, that question of like, saying that racism on some level, has fueled some of the ambition to write a book that overwhelms. Have things changed in New York? Have you experienced more kinds of racism, different kinds of racism?
I mean, at least for me in New York, when I was a banker, I radiated money. Like I would be walking down the street and it would be like heat waves coming off of me for money. And there are people who, if you have enough money, race matters very little. What really matters is that I have the money that you want, and so you're going to do what I tell you to do. You know, and that's a nice position to be in. I've had people ask me, if I speak English, but New York is such a melting pot that hasn't been my experience in New York. I was talking to a black man who was telling me that he's now in his 60s, that when he was growing up, he just disliked whites. And now he says that during Thanksgiving dinner, half the table is white because so many people have married white people. And, interracial relationships are very common. I'm married to a white woman. And these are just, so it doesn't feel as strong to me. But I do know that for me, for a long time, because my wife is white, everything she would say, I would slightly discount it. Because a part of me would think, okay, how can you really know this thing? Because you're white. And then I realized, that this is crazy, among other things. But, a lot of the stuff you make up in your own head. I remember walking down, I got off at the train in the town where my parents live, and was walking from there to my parents' house. And somebody drove by and threw a bottle at me. And my first thought was that this had to be some race thing. And then I thought, looking back upon it, it could be just some fucking idiot who goes around throwing shit at people. And, what happened for me when that occurred was I was afraid, and then I got angry. And in my anger, all these old hurts came back. And now, because I'm older, my response to it, after that little anger and hurt and all that stuff, is to think, thank God I'm not some guy driving around throwing stuff at people, Thank God I've moved into a world where that is not my life.
I think that these are some of the sections in your book when you talk about the early days, because I moved to New York in 2006 or something, very late, and so to sort of encounter in your book the world of Queens with just like a handful of Indian families. I can't imagine it, and I grew up a little bit in Delhi, so that idea of just there being a small number of you, everybody being up in everybody's business, but supporting, and being there. Is that something, how has that changed now?
There was a time that if you met an Indian, like in a store, you would be obligated to invite him or her home for dinner. Like it would just be rude if you did not. People didn't pray in temples. Mostly people prayed in each other's homes. People were, it was a very different time because either you knew everyone or you certainly knew somebody who knew that person. And it was also strange. My parents immigrated when they were in their late 30s and early 40s, which is very late for anybody to immigrate. And so my brother and I were much older than the other Indian children. And so we were part of the first group of Indians to go through these schools. And it was interesting to think of ourselves as sort of path breakers, and being asked to come visit people and offer advice as to what their children should do, and feeling very protective. Like every time, I still have this response, every time I meet an Indian who doesn't have an accent, I feel very protective because that's sort of the response. The only people who didn't have accents when I was growing up were the little kids. Yeah. And so you automatically feel this sort of surge of, okay, let me take care of this person. It was a different time. My experience of it was very, very positive. The Indian community has many problems. Because my parents were so admired, we were treated as sort of, we were really privileged within that community. And so we saw only the most giving aspects of the community.
But then I think your book does touch on also the the use of shame in these communities, right? The father in your book develops a drinking problem, and it's a matter of huge shame and secrecy and keeping face. I think we can open up for any questions, if anybody has any.
I just want to say that I'm in the middle of reading your book, and I love every word, and I'm totally immersed in it. I'm just totally immersed in your book. I love every word. Without really talking about me, I can just tell you that I had an illness and I was unable to read for 3 years, and I'm a book junkie since I'm a child. And this is the first novel I'm reading after 3 years, and it's perfect because of the pacing and the way it goes. I can go in, I can go out, and I'm not overwhelmed, and it's just beautiful. So I also read your piece in the New York Times, The Trick of Life, where you were talking about the process of writing the novel, and you wrote about the importance of prayer for you. So I'm very curious how your prayer life affects your writing today and what you might be working on now.
I wrote an article when I was during the many years of writing this miserable thing. I began to lose my mind, and I began to have panic attacks, and I'm tremendously scared of medication. My doctor asked me if I wanted to take some pills. I decided that I would instead do some praying, because my family is very, very religious, and so what I had read from Reader's Digest, which is, at least when I was growing up, was a staple of all Indian households. One time I had read in Reader's Digest that, if you want to get happy, if you want to be happy, pray for other people. So I just began praying for people that I saw on the street. So I would pray for the little kid that I saw biking by. I would pray for, some woman. I would pray for whoever. And my first response to praying was actually anger and genuine hatred. Because I would see the little kid and I would say, God, please take care of this little kid. God, please give him good health. God, please give him peace of mind. Please give him satisfaction. And what I would feel welling up inside me is self-pity. And I would think, my life is horrible. Why am I being asked to care for somebody else? But I would keep praying, Like I'm good at following directions. And so I would pray, and over time, doing this thing, it's really hard to, with a heart full of hatred, I would pray for these people. And it would give me this sense that, wow, Akhil, you're just crazy. You're out and out insane. Like, you don't know this person, and yet you're full of hate. And over time, doing this enough, I began to see that everybody has difficulties, that if I began to think, lots of people fail at write one good book and that's it. Lots of people fail after that. So why, if it happens to other people, why should it not happen to me? In all these different ways, it gave me comfort praying. And I still pray regularly. I pray every day. And I have my same ritual if I pray for a lot of people. Some people I know, some people I don't. So lots of people that I'm envious of. And what I find is that it makes me want to be less controlling of my reader. It makes me aware of how complicated life is. It causes me to be much more. Before, with the first book, my nouns used to land in exactly certain places. There was a real precision as to where they would be, and so there was a sheen to the writing. Now, the nouns move around a bit; they wiggle a bit, and the fact that they're just slight, they're 2 centimeters from where they would be otherwise, gives the book a rougher texture. So that sort of, it has a tremendous effect on the prose.
Did you find yourself kind of changing your writing style to kind of get into the mindset of Ajay, who was so young, or was kind of the language? Do you approach writing from someone who is younger, like 8 years old, 10 years old, differently than you would approach writing from an adult's point of view?
So the question is, when you're writing from the point of view of a child, how is that different, really, from that of writing from the point of view of an adult? And obviously, children can't formulate sentences that are as complicated as an adult, and they can't process things in as complicated a way as an adult would, right? So when something occurs, a child might get frightened, but he might not have other responses to it. There's a flattening that comes. So what I did in this book is there's two beginnings. The first beginning is from the point of view of Ajay when he's in his 40s. And then the book begins to be about him recalling. And in the recalling part, when we're following Ajay, mostly the sentence structure is a little bit simpler when he's younger. As he gets older, the sentence structure and the diction becomes much more complicated. But because we know that Ajay, the older person, the adult, is present in the book, there is some give to it. It doesn't have to fit as precisely as it would be if we didn't have that knowledge.
You said that you read a lot as a child, and I'm wondering if you have any memories of reading a lot as a child, other books of that kind of immigrant genre that were helpful for you when you moved to New York. So
when I was growing up, we didn't have, at least my knowledge was that there wasn't much immigrant fiction. At least that was my knowledge. Nobody in my school offered me any suggestions. I remember when people began offering me Ruth Pawar Jhabwala as an Indian writer, but that was all when I was in high school or college. Actually, is when people began saying that. Nobody in my family reads, literally, and so it's nobody reads. Yet one person has begun writing poetry and self-publishing it. And which is always the case, the readers write, the people who don't read write, and this. So unfortunately, I didn't have that sense that being educated in that way. I read a lot of Hemingway, and because Hemingway writes about exotic countries, that felt a lot like writing about immigration.
Yeah, and he writes so much about being an outsider anyway, so yeah.
What problems did you and your parents go through when you immigrated to New York, coming to America? What problems did you experience on the journey to America, coming to America?
On the journey itself, we were...
Before the journey, on the way to the journey. Did you have any hardship trying to come to America? What was your life like right after you came to America?
We came to America, my father came to America in 1978 and 1979. To me, I don't think we saw America as hardships. We saw America as just one fantastic thing after another.
But I mean on your way here, in order to get to America.
To get to America, my father went and stood in the immigration line, applied for the visa. He got his visa. We bought an airplane tickets when we came. So it wasn't a complicated or difficult operation.
There was no problem in being able to leave your country?
No.
Because a lot of people do experience those problems.
Mm-hmm.
Quota systems and all those.
What were some of the things that you were in love with as someone with fresh eyes entering America, New York?
Uh-huh.
I think you came, did you say you came late 70s?
Yeah.
Who was, President, was it
Jimmy Carter.
Oh, Carter. Mm-hmm. Did you befriend any buddies? Did Did you go out and play?
So the question is really, I think, what was I responding to most strongly? What pressed itself on me? I had the aesthetic of a child, and so the things that impress themselves, like when you were a child, you love to eat ketchup. You love to eat weird stuff. So the aesthetic that I had was the aesthetic of a child. Like I loved to watch Bugs Bunny, and it really impressed itself upon me. Those sort of things. I remember being amazed by rain. I remember because rain is rare in India. To me, seeing a body of water was like seeing a body of money. Yeah. I was amazed at the greenery. I was amazed at that in the daytime, the shops would have their lights on, because in India you're so poor that you keep the lights off unless you absolutely have to turn them on. I remember how I had only seen one traffic light before I came, and I remember seeing all the traffic lights and being amazed that these things existed and that people would stop their cars. And I thought to some extent that maybe they were showing off to us by stopping their car, that nobody would actually be this polite. I remember going to the grocery store and being amazed, just astonished at all the stuff that was available. I kept wondering what happens if not everything is sold. Everything in America really amazed me. It really amazed me. I mean, I love this country.
As a first generation immigrant, I'm sure there are certain career paths that are stressed more than others, especially for Indian immigrants, whether it's being a doctor or an engineer or a banker as you were. What kind of motivated you to become a writer and kind of deviate from that path, and what was the reaction from both your family and friends?
At least in when I was growing up, our parents didn't know what bankers were, and so they would have felt okay if I became an accountant. But being a banker was a really weird thing for them. I think that they would not have wanted anything which involved salesmanship or involved letting white people have power is something that they would be very nervous about. And so they preferred if the children were technically competent, because technical information is always useful. So doctors, engineers, things like that. For me, the reason I became a writer is I was just really unhappy as a child, and it became a way of doing something with that unhappiness, turning it into something. When you write something, when you take something that you've experienced which is painful and turn it into something that is art, that you can claim as art, good art or bad art, that thing has less power over you. And that was, for me, my motivation. And I gave up being a banker, one, because I really hated it being a banker. But two, the unhappiness I carried inside me was so strong that it was that I needed to focus my energies on comforting myself in that way. I became a banker just because I wanted money, right? And I wanted money so I could feel safe. And I had a lot of money and I still didn't feel safe. And so at some point I thought, well, I then need to do something else.
Thanks, Akhil.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all for coming for this and for making this so wonderful with your questions. The book is also on sale at the desk so you can get your own copy if you don't have one already, and Akhil can sign it for you. And I welcome you to come back again. Next week is a panel on Italian-American culture with a professor from Fordham University talking about different ways Italians have become Americans. And the week after that is a book, Urban Appetites, which is about 19th century, how food is a lens to view the development of New York in the 19th century through looking at foodways and shops and so on. So that should be a really interesting conversation as well, bridging the 19th century and seeing how that carries over to the 21st. So thank you for coming, and please visit the museum. Thank you, Akhil and Parul.